The dust was a living thing, a choking shroud of pulverized earth and regret that coated every surface in the settlement of Providence. It settled in the lines of Alara's face, gritty against her teeth, a constant reminder of her desolation. The sun, a merciless hammer in the vast, bleached sky, beat down upon the crude wooden platform where she stood. Splinters dug into the soles of her bare feet. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was now a tattered gray rag clinging to her thin frame. Around her a loose semicircle of men had gathered, their faces a gallery of grim curiosity, casual cruelty, and simmering greed. They were farmers, prospectors, trappers, men whose hands were calloused from taming the land, and whose hearts, it seemed, were just as hard. They were here for the auction. Her auction. The thought was a shard of ice in the furnace of her gut. Her crime, the one that had seen her cast out, scorned, and now put up for sale like a lame mare, was the color of her hair. It fell down her back in a thick, unruly cascade, the color of a dying sunset, of maple leaves in autumn, of fire. To the grimly pious folk of Providence, it was the color of sin, a mark of the devil. Devil's daughter. They had hissed at her in the weeks since her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to the fever, leaving her alone, unprotected, and vulnerable to their fear-laced scripture. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jedediah, slouching in the shade of his own considerable bulk, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "All right, folks, settle down, settle down. What we have here is a special lot." His voice was a greasy drawl that made Alara's skin crawl. Strong back, good teeth, still young enough to have years of work in her. He conveniently omitted the whispers, the accusations, the reason she was here. But he didn't need to say it. Everyone knew. They looked at her hair, and they saw damnation. Alara kept her gaze fixed on a distant mesa, a flat-topped shadow against the horizon. To look at the faces in the crowd was to invite their judgment into the last untouched corner of her soul. She would not give them that. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, pricing her worth in bushels of corn and hard labor. A wave of nausea washed over her, hot and acrid. This was it, the absolute end of everything she had ever been. She was no longer Alara, a woman who had once loved and laughed and dreamed of a small garden. She was a thing, an object to be bartered for. The bidding started low, insultingly so. A few chickens, a sack of flour. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Her humiliation was part of the spectacle. The price climbed slowly, grudgingly. Jedediah worked the crowd, his voice rising in manufactured excitement. $5. Do I hear 6? A woman like this, handle a plow, cook your meals, warm your bed on a cold night. A bargain at twice the price. The mention of the bed sent a fresh tremor of fear through her. She saw the leering grins, the speculative, hungry looks. Her spirit, already so battered, shrank away, seeking a darkness within herself where they could not reach it. It was then that a hush fell over the back of the crowd. A subtle shift, a parting of the bodies as if a silent, irresistible force was moving through them. Alara's gaze was drawn from the mesa, pulled by the sudden change in atmosphere. They came not with the stomp of boots, but with the soft, near-silent tread of moccasins. A party of Comanche, perhaps a dozen warriors, emerged from the shimmering heat haze at the edge of the settlement. They were apparitions of leather and dust, their presence an immediate and profound challenge to the shabby authority of Providence. At their head was a man whose stillness was more commanding than any shout. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a simple leather vest. His face was a mask of stoic angles and sun-darkened skin, framed by 2 long, black braids interwoven with strips of otter fur. His eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over the scene, taking in the auctioneer, the crowd, and finally, Alara on the block. His expression was unreadable, yet she felt the weight of his gaze as a physical thing. It was not like the others. It was not leering or pitying or cruel. It was assessing. Jedediah faltered, his sales pitch dying in his throat. The townsmen shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving instinctively closer to the pistols at their belts. The Comanche chief ignored them all. He walked forward until he stood just before the platform, his warriors fanning out silently behind him. He looked directly at Alara, his eyes lingering for a moment on the fiery cascade of her hair, which the wind had lifted like a banner of her shame. Jedediah, finding his voice, puffed out his chest. "This is a private transaction, Chief. Best you and your boys move on." The chief did not even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Alara. After a long, silent moment, he spoke. His voice was low and resonant, the English words carefully chosen, as if he were translating from a deeper, more elemental language. He gestured not with coin, but toward two of his warriors who led forward 3 magnificent horses, their coats gleaming with health. Another warrior laid down a stack of thick, winter-prime beaver pelts. The offered value was staggering, far beyond what any man in Providence could afford or would ever consider paying. Jedediah's jaw went slack. The crowd murmured in astonishment. For the woman, the chief stated, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. Jedediah, eyes wide with avarice, looked at the crowd. No one countered. The deal was done. The chief looked up at Alara one last time, his dark eyes seeming to see past the grime and the fear to the very core of her. "The fire spirit," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough for her to hear, "is sacred to the people. It is not to be owned." The journey began in a stunned silence that was more unnerving than the jeers of the crowd had been. Jedediah, his hands trembling with greed, had untied the rough rope from her wrists, and the Comanche chief, whose name she did not know, had simply gestured for her to dismount the platform. He pointed to one of the horses, a sturdy paint mare, indicating it was for her. There was no rope, no shackle, no hand on her arm to force her. The simple expectation that she would follow was, in its own way, more binding than any physical restraint. Where would she run? Back to the men who had sold her? Into the unforgiving wilderness that promised a slower, but no less certain, death? So she mounted, her movements stiff with exhaustion and fear. The worn leather of the saddle was a foreign country beneath her. They rode out of Providence without a backward glance, leaving the settlement to shrink into a dusty smear on the horizon. Alara's world narrowed to the rhythmic sway of the horse, the creak of leather, and the broad, silent back of the chief riding ahead of her. He never looked back, yet she felt his awareness of her as a constant, subtle pressure. He was a man who seemed to inhabit his own silence, as if it were a fortress. His warriors rode with the same unnerving quiet, their faces impassive, their movements economical and sure. They were a part of the landscape, their dark forms blending with the long shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Alara was the anomaly, her red hair a flagrant splash of color against the muted browns and greens of the prairie. She was a discordant note in a silent, ancient song. Her mind, a maelstrom of terror, struggled to make sense of her new reality. The chief's words at the auction echoed, nonsensical and terrifying. The fire spirit is sacred. Was that what he saw in her hair? Not a devil's mark, but something else? The idea was too alien to grasp. Fear was a more familiar companion. She was a captive, purchased like livestock. The grim story she had heard whispered by settlers, tales of brutal savages, of torture and unspeakable fates for captured women, played in a horrifying loop in her thoughts. Every rustle of the prairie grass, every cry of a distant hawk, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her veins. Yet, the reality of her situation refused to align with her fears. No one spoke to her, but no one was cruel. When the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, the chief raised a hand. The party halted near a small, clear-running creek sheltered by a copse of cottonwood trees. Without a word, the warriors dismounted and began the efficient process of making camp. They moved with a practiced harmony, each man knowing his task. A small fire was kindled, its smoke rising thin and straight into the evening air. Alara remained on her horse, frozen with uncertainty. Did they expect her to work? To serve them? She knew nothing of their ways. The chief dismounted and, taking the reins of his own horse, walked them to the creek to drink. He then returned and stood before her mare, looking up at her. His face, in the softening light, seemed less severe. The hard lines were still there, but she could see the faint tracings of time around his eyes, the deep intelligence that lay behind their dark surface. He didn't speak. He simply held up a hand, a clear offer to help her down. Hesitantly, she swung her leg over the saddle, her muscles aching from the long ride. She nearly stumbled as her feet touched the ground, her legs unsteady. His hand shot out, not to grab, but to steady her, his fingers closing briefly around her upper arm. His touch was firm, impersonal, and gone as quickly as it came. But in that fleeting contact, she felt not brutality, but a surprising warmth that seemed to seep through the thin fabric of her sleeve. He then turned away and handed her a water skin. The gesture was so simple, so mundane, yet it felt monumental. It was an offering of sustenance, not a command. She drank, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She watched as he took a piece of dried meat from a pouch at his side and began to eat, his back to the small fire. No one offered her food directly, but one of the younger warriors placed a strip of the same jerky on a flat rock near, where she stood before moving away to tend to the horses. It was an invitation, not an order. The choice was hers. Slowly, cautiously, she picked it up. The meat was tough, smoky, and salty, but it was the first thing she had eaten all day, and it quieted the frantic knot of hunger in her stomach. As darkness fell, a profound and absolute darkness unknown in places with windows and lanterns, the world shrank to the small circle of firelight. The warriors spoke softly among themselves in a language that was all gentle consonants and flowing vowels, a sound like wind moving through tall grass. Alara sat apart, wrapping her arms around her knees, a solitary island of fear in a sea of alien calm. She was still a prisoner, she reminded herself. Her fate was still utterly, terrifyingly unknown. But as she watched the chief staring into the flames, his profile carved by the flickering light, she felt a new and even more unsettling emotion begin to stir beneath the terror. It was a sliver of confusion, a seed of doubt in the certainty of her own doom. He had not bought a slave. He had acquired a spirit, and she had no idea what that meant. The arrival at the Comanche encampment was not a triumphant entry, but a quiet merging. The village, a sprawling collection of hide teepees nestled in a wide, grassy bend of a river, appeared as if it had grown from the earth itself. Smoke from dozens of cook fires rose into the crisp morning air, carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children stopped their games to stare, their dark eyes wide with unfeigned curiosity. Women looked up from their work, scraping buffalo hides, grinding corn, mending clothes, their gazes lingering on Alara's strange, pale skin and above all on her hair. Yet, the stares were different from those in Providence. There was no malice in them, no superstitious fear. It was the frank, open curiosity of a people encountering something new and wondrous, like a strangely colored bird or an oddly shaped stone. They looked at her not as a demon, but as a phenomenon. Kamina, she had finally learned his name, hearing one of the warriors address him, led the party through the heart of the village. He moved with the easy authority of a man completely at home, nodding to elders, acknowledging the greetings of his people. Alara, riding behind him, felt like a ghost, a pale appendage to his powerful presence. She braced herself for what would come next, to be handed over to some woman as a drudge, or to be pushed into Kamina's own teepee as his property. The thought sent a cold dread through her, a fear more intimate and visceral than the public humiliation of the auction. But Kamina stopped before a modest teepee set slightly apart from the others. It was clean and well kept, but empty. He dismounted and, with a simple gesture, indicated that this was for her. Her own teepee. The implication was staggering. She was not to be a servant in another's home. She was not to be his concubine. She was being given a space of her own, a place of solitude, and, perhaps, of safety. The shock of it left her speechless, standing dumbly beside her horse. An older woman with a face like a beautiful, weathered map and kind, knowing eyes emerged from a larger teepee nearby. Comanche, Ilara presumed. The woman's long gray hair was neatly braided, and she wore a dress adorned with intricate beadwork. She approached Ilara without hesitation, her expression a mixture of scrutiny and compassion. She looked at Ilara's ragged dress, her bare, dirty feet, and the exhaustion etched onto her face. Then she smiled, a small, gentle curving of her lips. She said something to Kamina in their language, her voice soft. He nodded and replied in the same tone. Then he turned, and without another word to Ilara, walked away toward the river, leaving her in the care of the old woman. The woman, whose name she would later learn was Tiva, gestured for Ilara to enter the teepee. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious. A fire pit sat in the center, and soft furs were laid out for sleeping. It was sparse, but it was a sanctuary. Tiva left and returned a few moments later with a bundle. She unfolded it to reveal a simple but sturdy deerskin dress, a pair of soft moccasins, and a comb carved from bone. She pointed to Ilara's tattered clothes and then to the new ones, the meaning clear. Then she pointed to a bucket of water she had brought from the river. She made a motion of washing, then left Ilara in privacy. Alone in the quiet, sheltered space, Ilara felt the iron bands of control she had wrapped around her emotions begin to crack. The simple, unexpected gestures of dignity, a home of her own, clean clothes, the privacy to wash, were more overwhelming than cruelty would have been. She stripped off the filthy rags, the last remnants of her old life in Providence, and washed away the grime and the dust of the auction block. The cool water was a baptism. Putting on the deerskin dress felt strange, the soft, supple leather a caress against her skin. The moccasins fit as if they were made for her. She was being remade, shedding one skin for another. Later, Tiva returned with a bowl of warm stew. She sat with Ilara, not speaking, simply sharing the space as she ate. The silence was not empty. It was companionable, a quiet offering of acceptance. Ilara ate, the food nourishing not just her body but some starved part of her soul. In the days that followed, this became their routine. Tiva would bring her food, sit with her, sometimes speaking in her own language, not demanding an answer, but simply including Ilara in the sound of her voice. Ilara began to feel less like a prisoner and more like a convalescent, a person being gently nursed back from a great wound. She saw Kamina only from a distance. He was a constant presence at the edge of her awareness, leading hunting parties, settling disputes, speaking with the council of elders. He never approached her teepee, never sought her out. He was giving her space, time. He had brought her here, placed her in this strange new world, and then stepped back to let her find her own footing. The gesture was one of profound and baffling respect. She was not his property. She was his ward. The fire spirit was not a possession. It was a guest. And as the sun set over the vast, silent plains, Ilara would sit at the entrance of her teepee, watching the stars blaze to life in the immense, dark sky, and wonder at the strange, incomprehensible fate that had brought her to this place. The fear had not vanished, but it was no longer a storm. It was a low, distant thunder, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the faint, fragile stirring of peace. The days bled one into the next, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the shifting angle of the sun and the rhythm of life in the camp. Ilara's existence settled into a routine of observation. From the doorway of her teepee, she became a student of this new world. She learned the sound of the women's laughter as they worked together, the calls of the children playing their intricate games with pebbles and sticks, the deep, resonant cadence of the men's voices as they spoke around the evening fires. She was an outsider, a silent spectator on the fringe of a vibrant, interconnected community, yet the feeling of being an outcast was slowly, almost imperceptibly, fading. It was being replaced by a profound and aching loneliness, a different kind of pain from the sharp terror she had known before. This was a hollow ache for connection, for purpose. She was safe, she was fed, she was sheltered, but she was useless. The women of the tribe were pillars of strength and industry. Their hands were never idle. They tanned the hides that made the teepees, sewed the clothes with sinew thread, prepared the food that sustained the people, tended the sick, and raised the next generation. They were the sinew that held the community together. In contrast, Alara's hands were soft and empty. She had been given sanctuary, but she had not earned it. The realization settled in her not as a burden, but as a motivation. A small, defiant spark of her former self began to rekindle. She would not be a helpless doll, a kept spirit. She started with small things. She began to gather her own firewood instead of waiting for it to be left for her. She learned by watching where the other women went, what would they chose. At first, her bundles were clumsy and awkward, but she persisted. She took the bucket Tiva had given her and fetched her own water from the river, her arms straining with the weight, her feet learning the path. These were small acts of self-reliance, invisible rebellions against the passivity that had been forced upon her. Tiva watched these efforts with her quiet, knowing eyes, a flicker of approval in their depths. She did not interfere, allowing Alara the dignity of her own struggle and her own small victories. One afternoon, Tiva sat beside her and began to repair a tear in a child's small shirt, her needle flashing deftly. Alara watched for a moment, then retrieved the simple calico dress she had arrived in. It was washed now, but still torn. With hesitant gestures, she indicated the tear and then pointed to Tiva's needle. Understanding dawned on Tiva's face. She handed Alara a spare awl and a strand of sinew, then with patient, deliberate movements, showed her how to punch the holes and draw the thread tight. The stitch was different from any she had known, strong and practical. Alara's first attempts were clumsy, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar tools, but she focused with an intensity she hadn't felt in months. Mending that simple tear became a monumental task, a reclaiming of her own agency. Kamina remained a distant figure, a source of constant, silent observation. She would feel his gaze on her sometimes as she returned from the river, or as she sat struggling with a piece of firewood. He never approached, never spoke. His silence was a wall she could not penetrate, yet she no longer felt it was a wall of menace. It was something else, patience perhaps, or assessment. He was watching, waiting to see if the spirit he had rescued had the strength to burn on its own. One evening, as the camp settled into the quiet of dusk, he walked past her teepee. It was the closest he had been in weeks. He did not stop, did not even turn his head, but he slowed his pace for a fraction of a second as he passed. In that brief moment, his eyes met hers. There was no expression on his face, no readable emotion, but in the depths of his dark gaze, she saw a flicker of acknowledgement. It was not praise, not encouragement. It was simply the barest recognition of her existence, of her efforts. It was a silent, one-word conversation. I see you. And for Alara, who had spent so long feeling invisible or reviled, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a foundation stone, a place to begin building. That night, for the first time, she did not dream of the auction block or the frightened faces in Providence. She dreamt of her own hands, strong and capable, mending a tear in a piece of soft deerskin. The prairie summer deepened, breathing its dry heat over the plains. The days grew long and lazy, the river shrinking to a silver ribbon between its grassy banks. Alara had found a fragile equilibrium in her new life, a rhythm of small tasks and quiet observation. The fear that had once been a constant, suffocating presence had receded to a background hum, replaced by a tentative sense of belonging. She was still an outsider, her pale skin and fiery hair a stark contrast to the people around her, but she was no longer just a curiosity. She was becoming a familiar part of the camp's daily tapestry. The children, who had once stared from a distance, now sometimes offered her a shy smile. The women would nod in greeting as she passed. It was a slow, subtle weaving of her presence into the fabric of their lives. The turning point, when it came, was not a grand or dramatic event. It was a swift, and unexpected as a summer storm. She was returning from the river, a heavy bucket of water in each hand, her arms straining. Near the center of the camp, a group of toddlers were playing in the dust under the watchful but relaxed eyes of their mothers, who were busy tanning a large hide nearby. A rattlesnake, coiled and ready. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. The mothers were too far, their attention on their work. The boy, oblivious, was taking another unsteady step. There was no time to shout, no time to think. Instinct, raw and immediate, took over. Dropping the water buckets with a crash that sent water splashing over the dust, Alara lunged forward. She moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline, covering the distance in 3 desperate strides. She scooped the child up in her arms just as the snake struck, its fangs sinking into the empty air where the boy's leg had been a split second before. She stumbled back, clutching the startled, crying child to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of the dropped buckets and the boy's sudden wail brought the camp to instant attention. The mother screamed and ran toward them, her face a mask of terror. Several warriors, Kamana among them, materialized with weapons in hand. One of them dispatched the snake with a single, swift blow of a lance. The mother snatched her son from Alara's arms, checking him frantically, her hands flying over his small body, murmuring frantic, loving words in her own tongue. When she found him unharmed, she looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a dawning, immense gratitude. She placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head, a gesture of profound thanks that transcended language. Alara stood, trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her weak-kneed. The camp, which had frozen in alarm, slowly came back to life, the murmurs now ones of relief and awe. They were all looking at her, but for the first time, it was with undisguised respect. She had not been a passive observer. She had acted. She had protected one of their own. Later that evening, as the moon rose, a silver disk in the dark ocean of the sky, she sat by the small fire outside her teepee. She was still shaken, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Kamana standing there. It was the first time he had ever come to her teepee, the first time he had sought her out. He did not speak, but stood for a long moment, simply looking at her. Then he held out his hand. Lying on his open palm was a comb. It was not the simple bone one Tiva had first given her. This was a work of art, carved from the dark, rich wood of an ironwood tree, polished smooth as river stone. Its handle was intricately carved with the image of a hawk in flight. It was a beautiful, precious thing. She stared at it, then up at his face, her expression one of confusion. He gestured toward her hair, which was loose and tangled from the day. Then he placed the comb gently in her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, warm contact. It was not a payment. It was a gift, an acknowledgement. It was a silent statement that he had seen not just her action, but her courage. He had rescued a fire spirit, and today that spirit had proven its worth not through its strange appearance, but through its fierce, protective nature. He gave a single, formal nod, and then turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving Alara holding the exquisite comb, its smooth weight a solid, tangible symbol of her new place in this world. The incident with the snake had been a catalyst, dissolving the invisible barrier that had separated Alara from the rest of the camp. The tentative nods of greeting were replaced by warm smiles. The women, led by the grateful mother of the boy she had saved, began to include her in their circles. They would pat the ground beside them as they worked, a clear invitation for her to sit and join them. Language was still a formidable wall, but it was one they now worked together to dismantle stone by stone. Tiva became her formal tutor. In the quiet afternoons, she would point to objects, fire, water, sky, horse, and say the Comanche word, kuna, pa, tumpi, puku. Alara was a desperate and eager student, her mind clinging to each new sound, each new connection. She learned that the word for the boy she had saved was tavibo, sunchild. The women would laugh, a gentle, musical sound, at her clumsy pronunciation, but it was a shared, kind laughter, and she found herself smiling with them. Her world, once shrunk to the size of her own fear, began to expand again. She learned how to grind corn into fine meal using a smooth stone, the rhythmic work a kind of meditation. She learned to identify the scent of the sweet grass the women braided and burned to purify their homes. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, her hands finally finding useful work, her days filling with purpose. Her relationship with Kamina also underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The distance he had maintained was still there, a product of his nature and his position as chief, but it was no longer a chasm of silence. He would seek her out, not for long conversations, but for small, significant moments of contact. He began to teach her the language himself, with a different method than Teva's. He would ask her a simple question in his tongue, "Is the water cold?" and wait for her to puzzle out the meaning and formulate a response. He was endlessly patient, correcting her pronunciation with a quiet gravity that made her focus intensely. These brief lessons felt like appointments of immense importance. One evening, as a cool breeze whispered of the coming autumn, he did not just pass her teepee or stop for a momentary lesson. He gestured to the spot by her fire and sat down, stretching his long legs out before him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the flames dance and writhe, consuming the dry wood. The silence between them was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken questions. It had become a comfortable space, a shared territory. Finally, he spoke, his voice low in the twilight. He did not speak of the camp, or the weather, or her lessons. He began to tell a story, one of the Namuna legends. He told her of the creator who had made the plains and the mountains, and of the spirits that inhabited them. And then he told her about the spirit of the prairie fire. He spoke of how the fire, which seemed so destructive, was also an agent of cleansing and renewal. It burned away the old, dead grass, making way for new, green shoots to grow, stronger and healthier than before. It swept across the land, a terrifying and beautiful force of nature, and after it passed, the land was reborn. As he spoke, his eyes were on the fire, but Alara felt his words were directed at her. He looked from the flames to her hair, which caught the flickering light and seemed to burn with a life of its own. "The people do not fear the fire," he said, switching to English so she would understand the heart of his meaning. "We honor it. It has great power. It can destroy, but also cleanses. It brings new life in that moment." Sitting by a small fire on the vast, dark prairie, she finally understood. His first words at the auction, which had been so baffling and strange, now settled into her soul with the clarity of a revelation. He had looked at her, standing shamed and condemned on that platform, and he had not seen a demon spawn. He had seen a force of nature. He had seen a power that had been misunderstood and abused. He had seen something that needed not to be extinguished, but to be respected, to be given a safe place to burn. He saw her not for the shame that had been heaped upon her, but for the untamed spirit within. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost stole her breath, washed over her. It was not love, not yet. It was something more foundational. It was gratitude, so immense it felt like a physical weight in her chest. It was a profound and humbling sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. She could not find the words to respond, in his language or her own. So she simply met his gaze, holding it. In the quiet communion of that look, she hoped he could see the embers of the spirit he had saved beginning to glow, brighter and stronger, in the safety of his care. The tranquility of their isolated world was a fragile thing, a beautiful bubble destined to be pricked by the sharp edges of the world outside. The first sign of trouble came with the wind, a shift in the currents of the plains that had nothing to do with the weather. 2 Comanche scouts returned from a long patrol to the south, their horses lathered and their faces grim. They spoke with Kamina and the Council of Elders for a long time, their voices low and urgent. Though Alara could not understand all the words, she understood the tone. A shadow had fallen over the camp. A sense of unease rippled through the community, a quiet tension that replaced the easy-going rhythms of the past weeks. Later, Tiva came to her, her face etched with worry. In a mix of Comanche words and gestures, she explained, a group of white men, soldiers by their description, were moving through the territory. They were not just passing through. They were asking questions. They were looking for a woman with hair the color of fire. Alara felt a cold dread clamp down on her heart. A familiar terror she had thought she'd left behind in Providence. The world she had escaped was reaching for her again, its greedy fingers stretching across the plains. She knew, with a sickening certainty, who was leading them. It had to be Silas Croft. He was a rancher from near Providence, a man with a hard face and cruel, possessive eyes. He had been the most aggressive bidder at the auction, his desire for her a palpable, suffocating thing. She had seen the rage on his face when Kamina had outbid him, a fury that went beyond a lost transaction. It was the anger of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. He had not seen her as a person, but as a prize, and his pride had been wounded. Now he was coming to claim his property, cloaked in the authority of a uniform and a flag. The next day they arrived. It was not a full patrol, but a small, arrogant detachment of 5 men, led by Croft, who wore the jacket of a militia captain as if it were a king's robes. They rode into the edge of the camp, not with the caution of visitors, but with the swagger of conquerors, their horses trampling the prairie grass, their voices loud and grating. The entire village fell silent. The women gathered the children and pulled them inside the teepees. The warriors materialized from the edges of the camp, their faces like stone, their hands resting on their weapons. They formed a silent, formidable line between the intruders and the village. Kamina walked out to meet them, alone. He stopped a dozen paces from Croft, his posture calm, his presence an immovable rock against which the tide of their aggression seemed to break. Alara watched from the flap of her teepee, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt like a fox gone to ground, the hounds baying at the mouth of her den. "Chief," Croft began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we're tracking a fugitive, a woman. Stolen property from the town of Providence. We have reason to believe you're harboring her." Kamina's face remained impassive. He did not grant Croft the courtesy of a direct reply to the accusation. "You are on the land of the Nimanu," he said, his voice level and cold. "State your purpose and leave." Croft's face flushed with anger at being so readily dismissed. "My purpose is to reclaim what is mine by law. We know she's here, the red-haired witch. Give her to us, and we'll be on our way." No trouble, the word which struck Alara like a physical blow, throwing her back into the horror of the auction block. She saw again the faces twisted with hate and superstition. For a moment, the old, helpless fear threatened to swallow her whole. Kamina's eyes narrowed slightly. It was the only sign of his anger. "The woman you speak of is not property. She is under my protection. She is one of the people now," Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the stillness of the prairie. "One of you? Don't be ridiculous. She's a white woman, a Christian soul lost to you savages. We've come to save her." He glanced past Kamina, his eyes scanning the teepees, searching. "Alara, can you hear me? We've come to take you home. You don't have to stay with these heathens." His voice was a whip, trying to lash her with the promise of a world that had only ever brought her pain and condemnation. Home. The word was a bitter mockery. Home was the jeering crowd, the auction block, the whispers of Devil's Daughter, this camp. These people who had shown her a quiet dignity she had never known. This was more of a home than Providence had ever been. A choice, sharp and clear as a shard of glass, presented itself to her. She could stay hidden, cowering in the teepee, and let Kamina and his warriors fight her battle. Or she could stand. She could rise and face the monster from her past, not as the broken creature he remembered, but as the woman she had become. The fire spirit, the one who cleanses, the one who is not afraid. Taking a deep breath that was half prayer, half war cry, Alara pushed aside the hide flap of her teepee and stepped out into the stark sunlight. The old, ragged calico dress was long gone, burned in a fire of her own making. In its place, she wore the soft, deerskin dress Tiva had given her, and the moccasins that had molded to her feet. Her hair, the symbol of her shame and now her strength, was not loose and wild, but held back in a single, thick braid. The dark ironwood comb Kamina had gifted her secured firmly in place. She walked forward, her steps deliberate and sure on the earth she now knew. She did not look at Croft. Her eyes were fixed on Kamina's back, a silent statement of allegiance. The murmurs from Croft's men died as they saw her. They had expected to find a terrified, broken captive. They saw instead a woman who stood with a straight spine and a calm, defiant gaze. She came to a halt beside Kamina, turning to face Silas Croft, placing herself squarely between her past and her future. The shock on Croft's face was immensely satisfying. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, taking in her appearance, her composure, her position beside the Comanche chief. This was not the trembling waif he had tried to buy. Alara, he finally managed, his voice losing some of its bluster. What have they done to you? See, they've turned you into one of them. Come with us. We'll get you proper clothes, take you back to civilization. Civilization? Alara's voice, when she spoke, was not the timid whisper he would have remembered. It was clear and steady, carrying across the silent space between them. It was a voice that had found its strength. Was it civilized to put me on a block and sell me like cattle? Was it civilized to call me a demon because of the color of my hair? You speak of home, Mr. Croft, but the only home I see is here. Croft's face darkened, his confusion curdling into rage. You choose these savages over your own kind? They bewitched you. You don't know what you're saying. I have never known with more certainty, she replied, her voice ringing with conviction. I am not your property. I was never your property. I am not a thing to be bought or saved. This is my life. These are my people. And this, she said, placing a hand on Kamina's arm, a gesture of solidarity that was unmistakable, is my home. The finality in her voice, the absolute rejection of him and the world he represented, was the spark that lit the fuse. Croft's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. Then you'll die with them, he snarled, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. But he had fatally underestimated the speed and readiness of the Comanche. Before his fingers could even close around the handle of his gun, Kamina moved. He was not a chief giving orders. He was a warrior in motion. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with the hard, wooden stock of the rifle he carried. The blow was not meant to be lethal, but it was brutally efficient, catching Croft on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Croft crumpled to the ground, unconscious. In the same instant, the other warriors surged forward. It was not a chaotic brawl, but a coordinated, disciplined action. They moved with a terrifying grace and swiftness, disarming Croft's stunned men before they could even properly draw their weapons. There were no gunshots, no arrows loosed. It was a display of overwhelming, controlled force. In less than a minute, it was over. The 4 remaining soldiers stood, disarmed and humiliated, surrounded by impassive warriors. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. They had come expecting to intimidate a group of savages, and had instead walked into a hornet's nest of disciplined fighters who had neutralized them without breaking a sweat. Kamina stood over Croft's unconscious form, his expression one of cold contempt. He gestured to 2 of his warriors. Take them, he said in his own language. Leave him his horse, but take their guns. Let them walk back to their town and tell their people what happens when they come to our lands looking for trouble. The warriors hauled the dazed men away, relieving them of their rifles and pistols and marching them out of the camp. They slung Croft's unconscious body over his saddle and sent the horse off with a sharp slap to its rump. Alara watched them go, the dust rising behind them. The threat was gone. She had faced her past, and she had not flinched. She looked at Kamina, who was now watching her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she could not yet name, but it was fierce and proud. She had not been a liability to be protected. She had been a warrior in her own right, fighting with words and choices instead of weapons. She had declared herself one of the people, and in the heat of confrontation, the entire camp had seen her claim that title as her own. The spirit had not been tamed. It had been unleashed. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new atmosphere settled over the camp. The tension of the preceding days dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph and relief. The story of what had happened spread like wildfire, recounted in excited tones around the evening fires. They spoke of the chief's strength, of the warrior's swiftness, and of the firewoman, Kunapui, who had stood beside their chief and defied the intruders with a courage as bright as her hair. Alara was no longer a guest, no longer a ward. She had forged her place in the heart of the community through her own actions. The way they looked at her had changed again. The respect she had earned by saving the child had been for an act of instinct. This was different. This was respect for a deliberate choice, for an act of loyalty. She had been given the chance to return to the world of her birth, and had rejected it, choosing them instead. It was a bond sealed not in blood, but in allegiance. That night, the sky was vast and clear, littered with a brilliant spray of stars. A celebratory spirit filled the air, and the sound of a lone drum began to beat, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was the heartbeat of the people. Alara sat outside her teepee, watching the familiar scene with new eyes. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The ghosts of Providence had been banished, not by Kamana's strength alone, but by her own. She had found her voice, and with it, she had secured her freedom. Kamana approached her through the deepening twilight. He moved with his usual quiet grace, but there was a different quality to his presence tonight, an unburdening. He did not stop a few feet away, as was his habit. He came and sat beside her, so close their shoulders almost touched. For a long time, they were silent, but the silence was fuller and more charged than it had ever been. It was the silence of two people who had faced a battle together and won. It was rife with unspoken understanding. Finally, he turned to her. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of her small fire, was open, the stern mask of the chief set aside. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and touched a loose strand of her red hair. He did not just look at it this time. He took the strand between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture, his expression one of reverence. It was a gesture that undid a lifetime of shame. All the scorn, the whispers, the fear she had seen reflected in others' eyes because of this color, all of it was erased by the simple, profound respect in his touch. "Your spirit is strong, Kunapui," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Like the fire I saw. It does not cower. It burns brightly when challenged." She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of acceptance, of being seen and valued for the very essence of who she was. The part of her that others had called a curse, he called a spirit. "You gave me a place to let it burn," she replied, her own voice soft. She found she could finally put her gratitude into words. "You saw me, when everyone else, including myself, saw only a monster." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I saw a woman who had been caged, a spirit that needed the open sky." The drum continued its steady beat in the distance. The sounds of the camp were a gentle symphony around them. In that moment, the vast cultural gulf that had separated them seemed to vanish, bridged by a shared experience of hardship, respect, and quiet courage. She did not know what the future held, what their relationship would become. The language of romance and courtship was foreign to her in this context. But she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this connection was the most real and powerful she had ever known. It was not a grand, passionate declaration, but a slow, dawning realization. Reaching out, she tentatively placed her hand on his forearm, over the warm, strong muscle. It was a simple gesture, her first move toward him, an answer to his own. He did not pull away. He simply covered her hand with his own, his large, warm palm enveloping hers completely. It was a promise of partnership, a silent pact forged not in words, but in the deep, quiet language of two souls who had found sanctuary in each other. Several moons had waxed and waned, and the harsh breath of winter had begun to whisper across the plains. The vibrant green of the riverbanks had faded to a pale gold, and the cottonwood trees had shed their leaves, their bare branches stark against a piercingly blue sky. Life in the camp had shifted to a new rhythm, one of preparation and community. The crisis with Silas Croft and his men felt like a memory from another lifetime. Alara's life was no longer defined by what she had escaped, but by what she had built. She was Kuna Pui, the firewoman, a name spoken now with affection and respect. The deerskin dress she wore was one she had sewn herself, adorned with a simple pattern of blue beads given to her by Tiva. Her hands, once soft and idle, were now capable and calloused, familiar with the weight of an awl, the texture of hide, and the rhythm of grinding corn. She was no longer a student of their ways. She was a practitioner. In the mornings, she helped the women prepare food, her Comanche vocabulary growing more confident each day. In the afternoons, she had found a new, unexpected role. The children, fascinated by her strange origins, would gather around her, and she would scratch letters into the dirt with a stick, teaching them the shapes of the English alphabet. In return, they taught her their songs and games, their easy laughter a constant, joyful presence in her life. She and Kamina had become a unit, an unspoken partnership that was the bedrock of the camp's leadership. Their relationship was not one of public displays or passionate declarations. It was a thing of quiet moments and deep, abiding understanding. It was in the way he sought her eyes across the council fire before making a decision. It was in the way she brought him a warm broth when he returned, weary from a long hunt. It was in the shared silence as they watched the sunset, a comfortable communion that needed no words. Theirs was a bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship and cemented by mutual respect. He was the stoic, unmovable mountain, and she was the fire at its heart, a source of warmth and light. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a gray sky, they stood together on a low bluff overlooking the winding river. The world was hushed and still, wrapped in a blanket of impending winter. Alara pulled the thick buffalo robe Kamina had given her tighter around her shoulders, the scent of smoke and leather familiar and comforting. She looked out over the land, this vast, intimidating expanse that had once terrified her. It was no longer a hostile wilderness. It was home. She could read the subtle language of the landscape now, could see the beauty in its starkness, the resilience in its survival. She felt her own story reflected in it. Her internal world had undergone a similar transformation. The frightened, shamed woman from the auction block was a ghost, a shed skin. She remembered the name they had given her, Devil's Daughter, and felt not a sting of pain, but a distant, detached pity for the people who had needed to create such a monster out of their own fear. They had tried to define her by a single, arbitrary trait, to diminish her to a symbol of their own making. But Kamina had seen something else. He had seen a spirit. He had given her the space to discover that it was not a spirit of destruction, but of resilience, warmth, and fierce loyalty. He had not saved her, she realized. He had simply opened the cage door and trusted that she had the strength to fly. She glanced at him, his strong profile serene as he watched the snow fall. He felt her gaze and turned to her, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. He did not need to speak. She did not need to answer. Everything that mattered was in that shared look. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a part of this land, a part of its people, her spirit as untamed and enduring as the prairie itself. The fire within her, once a source of shame, now burned with a steady, peaceful light, a beacon of hope in the heart of the vast, silent wilderness. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly home.